we've got this very negative idea about CO2, but actually it's what we're made of, it's what your apple's made of, it's cows are made of it. It's a currency of life. Yeah, we've got to come up with a different way of looking at how this all works.
I thought cars were the big problem. I didn't know buildings were as big a problem as transportation. And I didn't know land use was a huge problem because we've been abusing our soils, burning down our forests, and just, acting like nature was there for us to chop.
Climate change and biodiversity loss are not two crises. They are interdependent and they need to be addressed together. Nature on the planet today is not in a good shape. We lost over half of our forests, half of our coral reefs, 3/4 of the wetlands, and 2/3 of the world's rivers have been dammed.
We've decided to go from a system which was balanced and decouple it into the system that's completely out of balance, and we're suffering the consequences with that. So essentially, you had CO2 in the atmosphere. It was taken up by plants photosynthesizing, and it's sequestered into the soil into very stable forms. And of course, over the thousands of years, that would then be put into fossil fuels and sort of locked away deep, deep, deep down. But the cycling CO2, the stuff that's sort of in and out, is a currency of life. There's lots of mechanisms that keep the climate cool, including keeping soil covered so it doesn't get very hot. It could be 40 degrees hotter on a bare soil than it can under vegetation. Big trees can be have this incredible cooling effect. The cool through that process of transpiration, and you can just feel it when you're under a tree. It's in the hot sunny weather. It's just, that's why animals go under there. It has that cooling effect, and so it's not re-radiating heat back out into the atmosphere, which is having that heating effect. In a very healthy system, like I say, CO2 will be taken up by the plants, put into soil structures, and then eventually eaten and then released in a cycle. So there's this kind of whole system function that just works completely, and it worked for a very long time. And we had herbivores in the system. We had huge herds all over the world of different grazing animals, all belching methane, and it was getting reabsorbed. And there's various methods of sort of oxidizing methane. All these very natural processes that all work together.
I then was finding out people who were looking at nature, farming, forests, pastures, as a way to heal. Like nature as the healer, nature as the first step, giving nature a seat at the table. And that changed my life. I found out that there was a way of grazing that emulated the way bison moved across the Great Plains here in the U.S., and it was changing farms quickly and beautifully and getting farmers out of debt and changing the water cycling on their farms. I'll give you an example. Farm after farm, ranch after ranch, throughout from 2013 to 2018, when I was making a bunch of short films about this, I would hear the same story. My grandfather told me there was a stream. My dad said it dried up. And when we changed the way we did our grazing, the stream is back. I heard that story so often that I would be like, okay, yeah, your stream's back. I would be silly about it and facetious about it, but actually it was amazing. And I learned that if you treat soils well, they absorb carbon. If you treat them poorly, they exhale carbon, basically.
a functioning healthy economy is dependent on functioning healthy ecosystems. Now there is a lot of studies that show that most of our economic activity is reliant on nature providing certain services that we just take for granted. Regulating the climate, providing pollination services, fertilizing the soils, the diversity of living beings, so biodiversity on the planet, flood protection, storm protection, clean air. We really know that it's less costly to conserve a functioning, healthy ecosystem than trying to restore it. Plus, once the degradation reaches a certain limit or a tipping point, it loses its self-regenerative properties and the ecosystem can collapse.
A lot of people like clean air and clean water. As a matter of fact, every human being I've ever met likes clean air and clean water. They don't know what they're looking at when they see a field that's empty. Uncovered soil is a disaster. You know, when you see a field that has no plants growing in it between crops, fallow fields, that's like an oil spill, but it's a solar spill. But it's just as destructive.
An ecosystem is a plant photosynthesizing, putting carbon through its roots into the soil food web. The whole fertility of that plant depends on everything eating each other. It depends on bacteria absorbing nutrients from the rock. It depends on the protozoa eating the bacteria and then releasing through the decay and necronomass and sort of excretions of those organisms. The plant gets fed. That's just death and decay at a small microscopic level, but they're all living creatures. And then those plants will be then eaten by an animal and balanced by an animal. The insects that are eating the plants will be regulated by, predation and wasps, and the whole system is utterly intertwined and balanced through the interaction between plants and animals. I think that's the only way forward, is to sort of, for everybody to get a proper understanding of how functional ecosystems work.
Farmers tell me they get to see a lot more nature, like they're seeing a lot more nature, like spiders in the morning, that bit in episode 1, right when we meet Cooper and Katie. And they're like, did we not notice the spiders before? Or there are a lot more spiders, right? And then you find out there's a lot more dragonflies. What do those dragonflies eat? They eat mosquitoes. And so all of a sudden, these bugs that were problems before because they only had one type of thing growing, and that bug thrived on that one type of thing. When you have a lot of things growing, a great diversity of forage, you draw in a lot of bugs. And when you draw in a lot of different bugs, that bug that was a pest is now in check because there's other bugs that might eat it. And it actually, in a balanced bug system, it might become like a great member of society where it does its function and it's not out of whack. When we have diversity, it's a stronger, more resilient system, so that when one bug shows up that is a true pest, there's a lot of people that will say, thank you, you're very tasty. And it's checked. And so therefore you don't have to spray pesticides and insecticides. And it just keeps going that way. I call it unintended benefits. Alan Williams calls it compounding benefits. So you can sort of spiral in the right direction or spiral in a much more desertified direction, a much more unproductive direction where you need all those inputs. You need fertilizer because nothing else is providing it. You need insecticide because you've only got one kind of plant growing and you've got bugs that are out of whack.
Really what's required is a whole different paradigm, because you can see that happening in the wider world as people are saying, oh, well, we need food production. We need food production to become more efficient so we can hand more land back to nature. And the problem is that nature doesn't stop at a fence. Nature requires a whole system. You can't just say, right, well, we're going to be really intensive there, use lots of fertilizer, lots of sprays, and then that's not going to impact nature elsewhere. We're going to put that area over to those, that wild species. But those wild species need a clean environment and healthy watersheds and not to be killed by pesticides and to be able to migrate across land and have a shared ocean that's not polluted by fertilizers. So it just doesn't work that you can separate and segregate nature and then be really efficient somewhere.
ecosystems such as mangrove forests, salt marshes, seagrass meadows, they are real climate and nature champions. A lot of people don't know this, but actually wetlands occupy less than 5% of the global land area, but blue carbon ecosystems are responsible for about half of the total carbon that is buried in ocean sediments yearly. They're also critical for biodiversity. They are actually providing a lot of food and refuge and nursery habitat for many of the mammals, reptiles, birds, and fish that are driving global fisheries worldwide. They're also amazing in terms of storm protection, protecting coastlines against damage and change and floodwaters. So how come they have all these incredible properties and we're still losing them? They're still in decline. We lost 30 to 50% of the mangroves.
And ultimately, we have to get to a point where we've got nature working completely everywhere. How do you look at these problems differently? How do you reframe things? How do we increase biodiversity? How do we improve the watershed? How do we build soil so that we can make money from sunshine and water into the future forever and pass it on to our next generations?
Okay, how can we stop and just envision a really different world? I believe that we live in really extraordinary times where we can create a future where nature and people thrive. And the way to do that is to reconnect to nature, because we can only protect what we love.
I hope you've enjoyed this weave of inspirational voices, each clip brought in from our longer interviews. I've created this episode as an example piece that starts to compile the huge range of wisdom and knowledge that our guests have generously shared over the past few years. There's so much potential packed into our library, and I wish to keep exploring the possibilities of sharing regenerative understandings in new, accessible formats, suited to different styles and places of learning. If this episode prompted an idea for bringing knowledge to your own community or classroom, do please reach out to explore that together. And if you enjoyed this piece and would love to support the creation of more like it, you can find a growing range of ways to do that, including purchasing or distributing our art prints and greetings cards. Find the details in the description. A huge thank you to each of our guests, who are, in order of appearance: Caroline Grindrod, founder of Roots of Nature and trainer of regenerative agriculture; Peter Bick, director of Roots So Deep and wrangler of scientists; Deanna Denker, co-founder of Fair Carbon and expert on nature-based solutions. You can find their full individual interviews linked within the description. And be sure to subscribe, as we'll be catching up with each of them alongside hearing from many new voices as we get moving into this new season of We Are Carbon. So let's keep figuring this all out together.